it's wonderful to be here today. Thank you so very much for having me, and thank you, especially Marie-Claire and Marcus, for being such gracious hosts. And so COP30, I think it took place in a remarkable moment in history. So it was the first conference of the parties held after the world, unfortunately, officially crossed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that defines, as you all know, the boundary of climate safety. It was also the first COP hosted in the Amazon, which is not merely a symbolic backdrop, but one of the planet's most critical climate regulators. And of course, we also have this backdrop of urgency and geopolitical tension in the sense that expectations were high, but also tempered by realism. So many wondered, including many people that were involved in the process, in the COP process for a long time, whether the multilateral process could still deliver meaningful progress. So I think what emerged from COP30 suggests that the answer may lie not only in what is negotiated, but also increasingly in how negotiations are conducted. So today I wanted to share 3 reflections on COP30 outcomes, and particularly their implications on law and governance. So one has to be the new round of NDCs. 2, the influence of climate advisory opinions on the negotiation process. And 3, the evolving negotiation style that was introduced by COP30 and what it means for the COP process. So first, as for NDCs 3.0, under the iterative process of the Paris Agreement, 5-year cycle ending in 2025 marked the deadline for countries to submit NDCs 3.5, that is their updated climate targets looking toward 2035. And this new round of NDCs was expected to reflect the findings of the GST, global stocktake, and also significantly raise ambition, which is also mandated by the Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism. So some major emitters strengthened their commitments and clarified long-term decarbonization strategies. Others introduced sectoral targets, implementation roadmaps, but taken together, the aggregate level of ambition of the new round of NDCs still remains insufficient, and current trajectories continue to take the world on a pathway that is well above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I say this not because I want to be pessimistic, but I want to highlight that the law plays a central role. So NDCs are not merely political statements. They are increasingly interacting with domestic legislation, regulatory frameworks, and judicial oversight. So around the world, courts are examining whether government climate policies are consistent with national laws, constitutional rights, and also international commitments. So in that sense, the effectiveness of NDCs will depend not only on their numerical targets, if you will, but also on their legal integration into national governance systems, as, by the way, is mandated by Article 4.2 of the Paris Agreement through legislation, regulatory action, and accountability mechanisms. So to get to my second point today, my second reflection on COP30 outcomes, an important legal development surrounding COP30 was the growing influence of the international advisory opinions on climate change. So at COP30, the advisory opinions came up in negotiations, discussions in subtle, let me highlight subtle here, but also important ways. They did not make it to the final Belém package, but delegations showed increasing awareness that climate commitments are not only political promises, but also part of a broader legal framework that is evolving rapidly. So the advisory opinions contribute to shaping expectations about state conduct, and they reinforce the idea that climate commitments are not, as I said, purely political undertakings, but also increasingly embedded within broader legal obligations. And we have seen that the advisory opinions are already influencing domestic litigation. They have done so in Brazil, and over time, I'm sure they will influence legislative reform and also international negotiations as well. So, in other words, climate governance is no longer shaped only within the negotiation arena, but also in courtrooms, by legal scholarship and judicial interpretation across jurisdictions. And to get to my third and last reflection for today, I think it's also important to consider that COP30 also, in a way, introduced a new style of negotiations. So under Brazil's presidency, there was this deliberate effort to move away from the more traditional model of negotiation of ever longer texts filled with bracketed language and unresolved provisions. So instead, the emphasis was placed on implementation, practical cooperation, and real-world problem solving. So the COP30 presidency encouraged discussions focused on how existing commitments could be translated into tangible action. And this was done in several ways. So this included implementation pathways for the GST outcomes. It was actually suggested that the GST would work as a blueprint of sorts for implementation. Also, sector-specific initiatives, much like we've seen in Glasgow, and discussions on sensitive real-world agenda items such as transitioning away from fossil fuels, international trade, and critical minerals, just to name a few examples. So what I would like to say is that the COP30 presidency came from an idea in which the challenge today is less about negotiating new architecture and the multilateral climate regime, and more about operationalizing what already exists. So whether this model will become a lasting feature of the COP process, I think remains to be seen, or perhaps I should say processes, because as Chris just mentioned, COP17's CBD has also been dubbed an innovation and implementation COP, much like COP30 before it. So this what COP30 actually demonstrating is that shifting the focus from drafting language to delivering outcomes can actually reshape the tone and the productivity of negotiations. And finally, looking ahead to COP31, I think that the question is how this evolving landscape will influence the next phase of climate diplomacy. COP31 will likely build upon some of the lessons of COP30, balancing the need for cooperation and with this growing emphasis on the implementation that we've been discussing. But at the same time, geopolitical tensions are not going anywhere, and growing economic uncertainty and competing domestic priorities. So this challenge needs to be taken into consideration, and in tackling these challenges, the role of the law is, of course, essential. So the frameworks will provide continuity and predictability in a system that's often shaped by political type and buzzwords, and they enable regulatory developments and the idea is that can serve as tools to which citizens, civil society, and stakeholders in general can demand and help implement stronger climate action. And then this brings me back to where COP30 began, the Amazon. So holding a COP at the edge of the world's largest rainforest had, of course, symbolic weight and also practical significance. The Amazon is not only a vital carbon sink, it's a living reminder that the climate crisis is inseparable from biodiversity protection and also multi-level stewardship, also, which also includes effectively the local level. So to wrap up, hosting the negotiations in this region place the realities of climate change and the stakes of an action directly at the center of the diplomatic process. And this is, I think, one of the merits in terms of outcomes of COP30. And I really like the way the Financial Times put it. COP30 was always going to be different. So if COP30 succeeds in leaving a legacy, it may not be remembered for one single dramatic piece of text or bundle of texts, but it may mark the moment when the climate regime began to shift more decisively from negotiating new texts to implementing what we already have. So from promises to delivery, from political commitments to robust legal.
Thank you very much.